Welcome to The Explainer. In these presentations, we try to take really big topics and break them down into something clear and, concise.
So, have you ever wondered how a collection of ancient letters and biographies turned into one of the most influential books in history? Well, that's what we're going to dive into. We're going to explore the story behind the New Testament, not really as a theological text, but more as a historical and literary artifact. How did it actually come to be?
All right, so first things first, what is the New Testament? Let's take a look under the hood and see what's actually inside.
Okay, so the first thing to get your head around is that it's not one single book. It's really more like a library, a collection of 27 completely different texts. And these are all written by different people back in the first century, in what's called Koine Greek, which was basically the everyday common language people spoke on the street back then. You've got the four Gospels, telling the story of Jesus' life. Then there's Acts, which is all about the early church. Then you have a ton of letters, the epistles, and it all wraps up with Revelation, which is, well, it's a whole other level of apocalyptic prophecy.
So you take all these different pieces, and together they make up the second half of the Christian biblical canon, building on the foundation of what we call the Old Testament.
Okay, so if it's a collection of 27 different texts, who actually wrote them?
This is where it gets a little tricky, as it often does with ancient texts. So what do we know? Well, scholars are pretty much in agreement that nearly all the authors were Jewish Christians. But here's something that might surprise you. Those four Gospels, they're technically anonymous. I mean, the names we all know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they weren't on the original documents. They were actually added by church tradition way later, in the 2nd century.
Okay, now things get really interesting when you look at the letters or the epistles. Scholars feel super confident that the Apostle Paul wrote these 7 you see here on the left. They call them the undisputed letters. But the 6 on the right, that's a whole different story. There's a huge debate about whether Paul actually wrote them, mostly because the writing style, the vocabulary, even some of the theology, it just feels different.
And this timeline, this is so cool because it reveals something most people don't realize. The books in your New Testament are not in the order they were written. Not even close. In fact, Paul's letters from the 50s AD, those are the earliest Christian writings we have. They were written decades before the Gospels were even composed, which didn't start happening until around 70 AD.
So, wait a minute. If you've got all these different writings floating around in the early Christian world, how did this specific list of 27 books become the official one? I mean, who made that call?
And that brings us to this really important idea of a canon. A canon is basically the official list, right? It's the collection of books that a religious community says, okay, these are the genuine, authoritative scriptures. The process of figuring out what gets in and what stays out, that's called canonization.
And listen, this was not some quick meeting where a committee voted. No way. This was a messy, complex process that stretched out over hundreds of years. First, you had all these writings circulating. Then, of course, people started debating them. Slowly, over a long time, people started to agree on a core set of texts, the ones they felt were directly connected to Jesus' apostles. And only then did they start to make formal lists to sort of lock it all in.
You actually see one of the earliest arguments for a fixed four-gospel canon pop up around 180 AD. A church leader named Irenaeus made this really memorable, almost poetic case for it. He basically said, look, there are 4 zones of the world and 4 principal winds, so it just makes sense that the church should have 4 pillars, 4 gospels. It's a fascinating argument, right?
But the real turning point, the moment things start to solidify, comes in the year 367 AD. Athanasius, who is this really powerful bishop in Alexandria, sends out a formal letter, and in it, he lists the exact 27 books that we now know as the New Testament. That list was a game changer. It was so influential that later church councils at places like Hippo and Carthage basically just gave it their official stamp of approval.
Okay, so the list is set. The 27 books are chosen. But how in the world were these texts preserved and passed down for 2,000 years?
Well, the short answer is manuscripts. An incredible number of them. We have over 5,800 surviving ancient Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Just to give you some perspective, that is way more than we have for almost any other ancient book. It's an absolute treasure trove of evidence.
But here's the kicker, the really fascinating part. Because every single one of these was copied by hand, no 2 are exactly alike. Let that sink in. Not one is a perfect copy of another.
So you get all these little differences, what scholars call textual variants.
Some are just simple spelling mistakes, a scribe getting tired late at night. But others are entire stories that were added by scribes centuries after the book was first written. And these big additions have a special name. They're called interpolations.
And probably the most famous example of an interpolation is the story of the woman taken in adultery from the Gospel of John. It's a really powerful story. The only thing is, it's completely missing from our earliest and most reliable Greek manuscripts. It just wasn't there. That's why if you pick up a modern Bible today, you'll probably see the story, but there'll be a little footnote next to it explaining that it likely wasn't part of the original text.
All right, so let's bring this all home. Why does any of this matter? Why is it so important to understand this complicated history of who wrote these books, how they were chosen, and how they were copied? Because it shows us that the New Testament isn't some single monolithic book that just appeared out of nowhere. It's a library that was curated, composed, argued over, and preserved by very real human hands over a very long time. And knowing the human story behind the book gives us crucial context for everything that's inside it.
This whole history invites us to do more than just read the words on the page. It invites us to appreciate the incredible, messy, and deeply human journey these texts took to get to us today. And that really leaves us with one final question to think about. How does knowing the story behind a text change how we understand what's in it?